Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Ruben McDaniel. I'm the President and CEO of Dasney. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us this morning for the first of what we hope are many educational and informational seminars that Dasney wants to work with our partners, customers, guests, hosts, just to share more information about different topics so that we can all be more engaged. And I just think you'll find this topic to be a really engaging one this morning. I want to start by just wishing all of you a happy holiday season. Hope you have a safe, bubbled up, socially distanced holiday, but it is that season. We want to be happy and thankful. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Happy holiday season. First, what I want to do is just give you a little introduction to the topic. We're going to be talking today about a function that really crosses all of Dasney's functional lines: financing, construction, and most of all, sustainability. So we're talking about how can you use energy service contracts and other vehicles to creatively finance construction projects, particularly around the sustainability and efficiency components that we are all looking to get into our building. You know, Governor Cuomo has put a stake in the ground about sustainability for New York State. We are fully supportive of that, and our goal is to help you all do your job better as you implement these programs. So we have a great panel this morning. I will introduce by name, and then they will give you some background on each of them. But we've got Paul Koopman, our Vice President, who leads this area for us at Dasney. Stephen Antoine Smith, who's a Managing Director of Infrastructure Advisory at Ernst & Young. We've got Ron Herberst, Vice President at Braceford Dunleavy. Michael Nuringer, a Senior Associate at Orrick Harrington. We've got Jeff Poole, a Senior Counselor at Nixon Peabody, and Patrick Russell, the Managing Director of Education Nonprofit Group at Wells Fargo. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us this morning. Your contribution is really great. And I guarantee that if you're paying attention this morning, the next hour and a half, you will learn something today. So with no further ado, I'm going to sign off. I will come back to close, and I'm going to turn it over to Paul Koopman and the panel. Paul?
Thanks, Ruben. Good morning, everyone. And again, happy holidays. Let me start off by introducing, or have our panelists introduce themselves. Stephen, you want to kick it off?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Orton Smith. I'm a managing director in Ernst & Young Infrastructure Advisors. We spend our time advising tax-exempt clients on infrastructure and alternative delivery projects. I lead our work in the US on energy and environmental infrastructure, more generally encompassing renewables, water, sanitation, and decentralized energy. And I'm based in New York.
Thank you. Ron?
Good morning, all. From the Seattle bubble. I lead the energy and utilities practice for Brailsford and Dunleavy. We are owner advisor working in higher ed primarily. We've delivered over $40 billion of P3 structured projects for higher ed. My background is working both sides of the fence, both as a owner's advisor and provider of finance for clients, and also as a developer. And so I understand both the developer side and also the delivery side and oversight from an owner's perspective. My background is engineering and architecture. I came to the way of alternative finance through learning how things are built from the bottom up and understanding the problems that you all have in delivery.
Thank you. So we're going to give Ron a break on any questions because he got up especially early. So thanks, Ron. Matt.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. So we've got quite a list of people here, about 120 people. So normally be in front of a packed crowd here, but we'll try to get the same adrenaline going. My name is Matt Nuringer. I'm an attorney at Orrick Harrington Sutcliffe. I am focused in the energy and infrastructure practice, in particular on the public-private partnership, alternative delivery, design, build realm. We act as legal advisors to governments, to developers, and to financiers, lenders in the space. We act for a handful of state agencies, including the Port Authority, MTA, ESD, municipalities across the state, and our favorite public authority, the Dormitory Authority of the state of New York as well, through their P3 panel. So excited to be here and look forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Matt. Jeff.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Pohl. I'm with the council with Nixon Peabody, but most of my career was spent in state government, 34 years, first with the Office of State Controller, and then 15 years as General Counsel of the Dormitory Authority. But since that time, I've been in private practice, public finance, working with public authorities, local governments, local development corporations, on general matters of public finance and procurement. And I do have an interest in this area. Recently worked with a client, although they were doing just design build, that was seeking to replace their steam system with more, with electric-based electricity to the extent their budget permits. So I'm very interested in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Jeffrey has, again, unique insight coming from state government and the nexus between state government and this program. And last but not least, Patrick. You're on mute.
Sorry, the sign of the times in Zoom. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Thank you. Welcome and happy holidays, everyone. Pat Russell, I'm the head of our higher education and not-for-profit group. Been in the higher education industry and finance industry for almost 30 years now. Historically concentrating on public-private universities, over the last 10 to 15 years, in addition to just normal financings. I'm getting into the P3 front, initially starting out in the housing side, and over the last 3 or 4 years, working on several different utility P3 projects for public institutions across the country. Excited to be here, and obviously, Dasney is one of our favorite authorities as well. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Just some quick logistics. So you will be able to enter questions. We will probably leave about 20 minutes at the end. To the extent you've typed in a question and we do not get to it, we will do our best to respond to it at a later point and post the information on our website. But again, we hopefully will have time to at least get to most, if not all, the questions. Just one quick shout out. I want to thank Deborah Fasser behind the scenes, who has helped organize this and made sure all the technology, because if it was up to me with the technology, it'd be an audience of one. So thanks, Deb, for all your help. Let's get right into it. Add a little definition around the topic. What makes a project a good candidate? What types of projects are we really talking about when we discuss alternative financing and construction? And what areas should higher education be focusing on? And I'm going to let Patrick kick that off.
Certainly. As I mentioned in my introduction, the higher education industry is really not new to the P3 industry. Over the last 20, 25 years, this P3s for student housing has obviously been around, but just historically, dining in bookstores has been kind of a natural extension of the P3, and just relying on private operators to come in and provide efficiencies. Most recently, the big ticket items that we've been seeing are utilities. We're looking at both brownfield, elimination of carbon emissions as a goal, just up tiering and really getting state-of-the-art utility facilities, and also looking a little bit at greenfield and adding solar to the mix of utility power on campus, which also meets sustainability goals, which is obviously embedded within every public institution across the country. So it's both a financial objective and kind of a sustainability objective of looking at utilities and ways of providing cleaner utilities and less costly utilities. Also looking at, there have been historically some parking transactions. I think with the advent of Lyft and Uber and other ride sharing, parking is going to be an area that's going to be, there are still deals that are getting done, but I think transportation, I think everybody's pretty well aware that it's going to be changing over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So parking transactions, I think there'll be a handful of those, but not necessarily going to be robust volume. Historically, urban campuses have been doing P3s with real estate and having joint ventures with developers and building either academic buildings, administration buildings, or housing, as I mentioned. So that's kind of always going to continue. Healthcare is an interesting one. 2-3 years ago, Vanderbilt basically separated their academic medical center into 2 separate credits. Now they have the benefit of not being able to, or not having the risk related to healthcare. And I think the important fact on that transaction is when the university side looked at it, they realized that university and academics moves at a much slower pace than the medical side needed to move. And I think a natural diversion of those two are going to make both of those entities more efficient operators. Then last but not least is athletic. And sometimes this is going to be done on an individual basis, and it's always been done obviously with your sports marketing. But a perfect example is 2 or 3 days ago, the SEC announced a $300 million contract with ESPN. And those big ticket TV revenues obviously support a lot of athletic departments, as you know, everybody knows, there might be 5 to 10 athletic departments that actually support themselves across the country, and those specific sports actually, you know, also really support the entire athletic system. So, you know, those are generally the areas that we are seeing a lot of involvement in. You know, any area that is, I guess, you know, maybe relates to not the academic side, the research side, or anything else that pertains to campus is an area that P3 might provide some, you know, some benefit by having a private operator or being able to redeploy capital that's tied up in physical assets that, you know, can be used by the university to, you know, enhance faculty salaries or expand programming or anything else like that. So it's just a good way to reassess where you want to have your capital deployed on campus.
Stephen, what are you seeing in the energy market there as it relates to higher education and where campuses are focusing?
Yeah, I'd echo what Pat talked about. I think there are, you know, I'd kind of in utilities, I'd kind of break it down into 3 kind of buckets of drivers, and each transaction has different combinations of these. But in essence, there's what I would characterize as like a performance-based driver. So either, you know, the existing utility system, it has low levels of reliability or impaired levels of performance and efficiency. Perhaps, you know, in a number of private institutions that we've been working with, staffing and staff retention is a big issue when you're running a central utility system and you can't retain or recruit staff to run it. And therefore, there is a kind of a performance and kind of operational resilience reason to consider transferring some or all of this service to the private sector, who can then effectively to buy back energy as a service. I think taking that one step further, and as Patrick mentioned, there are some, you know, pretty compelling service transformation drivers towards decarbonization, and that might require significant deployment of capital or significant deployment of resource in redesigning, rebuilding, and operating a much more complex system, be that a microgrid or through electrification of infrastructure and reduce reliance on fossil fuels, or switch to geothermal and biomass. And, you know, again, many institutions just don't have the operational expertise to deliver that kind of transformation, or indeed the capital. So again, that's another driver. And I think the third one, which certainly in some of the transactions that Patrick's been advising on have been at least capturing the imagination of others, is the financial driver. And that is the principle of monetizing budgets to create an upfront capital receipt, which can then be used for value add purposes, whether that's, you know, placed in a new endowment or an unrestricted fund, or used to help reorientate the institution towards higher value academic or to, purposes, or to clear deferred maintenance, what have you. So what a lot of transactions are doing is either seeking to monetize the performance improvement and cost savings that arise from performance and service transformation drivers, and turn that into an upfront sum, or potentially restructuring the budget completely in order to create debt capacity on the part of their private sector partner to transfer capital back to the institution. Now, I don't think any one project is solely driven by one of those 3 criteria. Typically, there are multiple criteria in play, and the relative weight of those depends on the position an institution is in and what its core objectives are.
Okay, thank you. Jeffrey, I know you've had some experience on the public side of the world. Would you like to add anything as far as kind of the public sector nexus with these types of projects and what you're seeing? You were on mute. Happens every time.
You know, listening, I mean, I you know, obviously my experience is a little bit more parochial, largely confined to New York. But, you know, as they describe what they think the objectives are, I was sort of looking at some of the things that I saw out there to sort of guide what might work here. I mean, you know, the old standard, the true one is, you know, Dasney's tax exempt lease program, where we've done, you know, using lease back structures to finance the purchase of energy upgrades, et cetera. We've also overlaid, at least in one instance when I was at Dasney, the energy performance contract concept. where the lease payments would have been made from energy savings, and there was a guarantee from the service provider. But I think the one that they're focused on, and the one that was sort of intriguing me as I started to look at this, is the energy of this as a service, where you replace the existing technologies that burn fossil fuels and emit, the dioxide with these low carbon technologies. And it seems that they do it on a design, build, own, operate type of basis, where the service provider seems to buy the institutions or get an interest in the energy plant upgrades and sells the power to the institution. It doesn't appear that there's an upfront investment by the institution. And in the case of one college, it looked like they were able to monetize some excess capacity. Dartmouth College, I don't know where they are in their process, but they have an RFQ out where they want a developer to design, finance, construct, and operate, a new thermal generation facility that will replace their steam distribution with hot water. That the developer will be responsible for getting, the conduits to the various dorms and other facilities that will use it. They will be responsible for operating and maintaining it. The RFQ says that the developer will be responsible for financing it, and that Dartmouth desires to keep it off the book. Ohio University did a similar transaction with their heating system. They conveyed it to a quote concessionaire who was going to operate it, have an obligation to improve it, but they got $1 billion up front as part of the transaction. Then the other theme, and then we don't have to, that maybe we'll spend some time on. It seems that some colleges, I found we're joining together to purchase renewable energy credits, which are those credits that are used to document and trace, energy, green energy projects. Apparently, Bowdoin, Smith, Hobart, Hampshire partnered, together to construct a solar plant. I don't know who's designing and building it, but the college received the credit for the renewable energy, so they were able to meet their clean energy goals. They're also going to be purchasing some of the power, and apparently by them cooperating together, it gave them the economies of scale that made this type of solar project useful. So those are the things, as I listen to them, these are sort of the structures that come to mind. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I hope that helps.
So Matt, you've been involved in, I know, a lot of deals. You want to add a little bit to that as well in terms of very, specific transactions that you think are applicable in the New York State market?
Sure, Paul. So we'll just hone in on two just narrow distinctions that I think we're going to suss out a little bit more through this conversation. So in the context of energy as a service, or P3 in the classical sense, you really have sort of two different core buckets. And Dasney has a form energy saving performance contract that has been developed for its program that has the flexibility to be able to integrate these types of projects. So first is an availability payment style project. So if you look at what's being done right now at Fresno State University, where we're currently acting for the preferred proposer there, which includes Meridium and Noresco. That deal is a more classic sense energy efficiency project, but it's being paid for through availability payments. And so what that means is that instead of the developer taking third-party revenue risk or taking revenue risk on the project itself, the developer is being paid based on making the asset available to the university in a pre-agreed condition based upon key performance indicators that will entitle the university to deduct from that availability payment should those key performance indicators not be properly delivered. And then the other structure that Stephen and I had worked on is in connection with a private university called Duquesne University. And in that type of structure, instead of an availability payment, what you have is a upfront payment for the asset itself. And in return, the asset is transferred through an asset purchase agreement to a developer. And then the developer is then providing all of the required energy under the energy services agreement to the university. And so the university is paying for the energy that's received. And as part of that payment, there are sort of three different components. One of those components is actual consumption. Another is a component for debt service equity. And then another component is for making those assets available to the university. So there's a lot of distinctions and reasons why you might go with one or the other. And I think we should think about talking about those distinctions through this conversation.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So Ron, in terms of, I'll call it the master planning process, I know your firm has been involved in a lot of development of campus planning. Certainly, given that sustainability is now probably at the top of the list of many campuses in terms of concerns, issues, in terms of how they plan for it, how they finance it. How are these types of projects tying into master planning, and has there been a difference that you've seen in how campuses are approaching their overall planning process?
Yeah, sure. I think the appetite for deeper partnerships has just grown. We're tracking about 25 of these major client initiatives around P3 outsourcing. And the desire to move out of the energy services business is a trend, which is just expanding from efficiency retrofits, as we've known prior through energy performance contracts, to deep partnership agreements, long-term concession operators with the ability to structure finance and take a bigger slice of the pie. The depth of the projects is growing. We just need to clearly define with the client what the boundaries are of the project that they want to take to market, and what the baselines are relative to current operating costs, deferred capital, and need for transformation initiatives. So an end-of-life utility infrastructure project is fundamentally different than a large-scale energy efficiency retrofit program that's delivered as a service. So part of our job is to define those boundaries, do it through a strategic engagement that fits institutional's mission, understands where they want to be relative to their core mission, how to include the partnership model in a way that enhances the educational outcomes. So a lot of interest in deployment of innovation technologies that have a research value. And then there's this new angle, which is around resiliency and flexibility and COVID response. So I just want to call out that a lot of institutions have dug themselves into a hole relative to making buildings safe. And they have now a huge retrofit need to improve ventilation and indoor air quality. So we've seen this new nexus around efficiency in healthy buildings and the need to accelerate retrofits in the buildings, in addition to do the transformative work in the central plant distribution systems.
Interesting. And Stephen, in terms of kind of how, when you're approaching clients, how they're looking at these things from a financial perspective, are you seeing kind of a different thought process? Is it not just about the dollars and cents? Are people incorporating, the need to, achieve sustainability goals? I'll say, quote, attaching a monetary value to that. How are they looking at this?
I think it depends very much on the kind of institution you are and where you are in your kind of thought process. So we have a number of clients who are solely focused on sustainability. So wealthy private institutions or relatively wealthy state institutions who have a clear state mandate are focused, and the purpose of the project, and this comes to the core of it really, is having a clear transaction purpose. You have to, if you're going to do something like this, which is not a small undertaking, you have to do it with a clear sense of purpose and for a good reason. So that for those wealthier colleges who have clear greenhouse gas reduction targets or renewables targets, then that is primarily the case. So they still want to do it in the most cost-effective way possible, but they're primarily driven by that service transformation objective. For those somewhat less wealthy colleges, or those who have taken more of a knock in COVID, or the mid-tier state universities who are seeing increasing levels of restriction coming in their funding sources, then the financial drivers become more dominant. And I think it's often not it's not necessarily about survival. This isn't doing an energy P3 or a P3 generally isn't the difference between surviving and not surviving, but often a lot of, at least in my experience, mid-tier state universities have a lot of entanglement in their endowment and want to deploy capital but can't free up that capital to do so. So the idea of monetizing assets to create unrestricted funds to pursue the things that they know they need to pursue gives them a lot of value in operational freedom, which transcends differential cost of capital.
Patrick, anything you'd like to add on the financial side? You're on mute.
Sorry about that again. I think the one consistent theme is that there is no cookie cutter approach for every institution. Every transaction is going to look differently. Every institution is going to be looking at these transactions, but doing it for what benefits them, whether it's redeploying capital, sustainability goals. Like I said, it's very unique to each institution within the public's, mid-tier, flagship, and privates. Again, everybody has different goals. I think you just have to make these decisions really independent of how other institutions are taking a look at the projects as well.
Okay. Just while we're on the financial side, so I don't want to call it a myth, but there's this theory of, quote, off-balance sheet projects. And I'm going to throw it out to the group, and I think maybe Stephen or whoever else would like to jump in on this. Is that a real thing? So, given the financial pressures we're dealing with, someone says, oh, great, it's off-balance sheet, but am I getting free money out of this? I guess, but let's throw that out there, and
Right.
Stephen or Patrick or Stephen,
Okay,
you want to kick it off? Yeah.
I'll have a go, seeing as probably probably other accountants, but no one wants to own up to it. Right, there's a few different things here. So you mentioned a couple of things, Paul. So there's off balance sheet from an accounting perspective. There's free money, which is a whole other thing, and then there's off credit, which is something else again. So, I mean, the easy ones are these transactions are going to be on credit one way or another. So the credit rating agencies will, regardless of accounting treatment, look at this from a credit impact on the university. And the majority of projects that we've seen that have been well structured, either by us or other advisors, are generally viewed as credit neutral. So you are creating a longer term liability in terms of utility purchase obligations, but you are trading that off against free cash, which can be used for providing its use for productive purposes is weighted against that. The accounting treatment is a little trickier, and the answer depends on a number of things. If you are accounting under GASB, so if you're a state accounting institution, the chances of getting this off balance sheet are very low, particularly in the context of GASB 94, the latest kind of public-private partnerships guidance from GASB. You are almost certainly going to create a long-term liability obligation that goes with the P3 project. Now, that may or may not necessarily be a problem, depending on how you're accounting for, if you're doing a monetization transaction, how you're accounting for that proceeds. And Ohio State and others, are recording that long-term liability on their balance sheet. If you're a private institution accounting under FASB, you have more latitude. And the transaction that Matt referenced earlier, the Duquesne Energy project, was off balance sheet under FASB. So that requires two separate things to happen. One, the P3 contract can't be accounted for as a lease because all leases are now on balance sheet. So you have to sidestep lease accounting in terms of the long-term arrangement. And then secondly, if you are doing a monetization transaction, so you're receiving cash proceeds, you also have to avoid those cash proceeds being treated as part of a financing transaction. So you have to de-recognize the asset as a true sale. So there are kind of two accounting hurdles you have to overcome if you're a private institution, if you want to get this truly off balance sheet. And there's a myriad of complexity in there, but what it really boils down to for most colleges is there has to be another source of income for the P3 beyond the university itself. So there has to be a third-party customer to, rule of thumb around at least 10%. So the university can't be the substantially sole customer of the P3. And then second, and that's the lease accounting kind of hurdle to get over. And then for the financing transaction hurdle to get over, if you're doing a monetization deal, then you can't have a presumptive right of reversion of the asset at the end of the contract. There has to be a right of first offer at some measure of market value. So you can't automatically get the asset back. which is typically the presumption in a P3 deal. So those are issues that can be dealt with, and Duquesne successfully dealt with them, and as have others. But it is something that has to be gone through to get to that point.
Great,
I'll pause there.
That's great. Everyone got free tax advice out of this, if nothing else. So that's good.
Oh, no advice was given. No advice was given.
To make that clear, very good. Needs it. So, we've hit already on a number of topics, and I know it can sound very complicated. But Matt, maybe you want to kick this part of the discussion off. So again, how complicated are these transactions we're talking about? I know there's different buckets. We should spend a little bit of time talking to the audience about what goes into kind of the planning, and what are we really looking at as I start these types of projects, and maybe we could segment them to kind of the pure ESCO projects versus these more global type utility projects. Maybe if you want to kick this part of the conversation off, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Paul. So just like anything that's worth doing, it's not easy. And I would say that these projects, in order to do them right, you want to spend the time up front and the diligence up front, structuring the deal properly so that that deal is able to sustain itself over a 20, 30, 40 year, in the case of Duquesne, a 40-year term, right? And so a lot of that involves getting the work done initially with external advisors and your internal stakeholders to ensure that the structure is resilient and the structure can withstand uncertainties over that length of a period of a contract. And so when you're thinking about the spectrum, let's start with the sort of traditional energy savings performance contract. There, right, if you were to go to Dasney, for example, to utilize their pool of energy performance contractors, Dasney could help procure those contractors through their panel. They could help bring advisors to the table to help facilitate the transaction and advise you through the initial investment grade audit process, which would be sort of the first step beyond analyzing your initial energy data, coming up with the types of assets that you want to identify for a project, and then facilitating the investment grade audit through the impaneled energy savings performance contractors, who would then provide some type of indicative proposal through that process. Once you've selected an energy performance contractor based on indicative pricing under the IGA, you would then advance to a full form contract. And once a contract is signed, you would then have a financial close either simultaneously or shortly thereafter, which would be used to fund the project and the capital improvements that would be implemented. So that type of transaction is a bit more straightforward, and there is a strong precedent both in the Dasney side of the house using tax-exempt lease purchase arrangements, the TELP financing program, as well as their traditional contract. And then in the more P3 energy as a service realm, which is kind of what we've been talking about, that's, I think, where deals get a bit more bespoke and complex. And for the reasons that Stephen described, right, you're sort of artfully crafting these transactions to meet very specific objectives. Off-balance sheet financing is a good example. So there, you're going to have to think about things like procurement, right? So if you are doing a project that is primarily about energy savings and performance, you could look at Article 9 of the state energy law, which provides for an exemption from the traditional WICS law, lowest bidder, design, bid, build structure that many public agencies would be subject to. If you're a private university, college, that's not a concern. Something that transcends both private and public would be labor arrangements, any type of labor union arrangements that you might have, where in the case of a Duquesne, for example, where you are transferring the assets. In that case, we've seen employees of the university be transferred over to the developer through a transition period, to the extent, obviously, those employees have to be willing. And through that process, the labor component of it is complicated. From a debt perspective, and Stephen mentioned this sort of being on credit, one of the things that investors and lenders in particular are going to be looking for is, where does your energy consumption payments, where does your availability payment in the case of a Fresno State type project sit in the order of priority relative to other obligations that you have as a university or college? And where are the revenues primarily coming from to fund those obligations? And so every project that I've worked on has had a funding white paper that you would work with your advisors to develop, that the lenders, the rating agencies, and the developer are going to use to underwrite the project. So that's going to be a complicated document, and that's going to require a lot of thoughtfulness in how that's structured. I think another layer of complexity is around the element that Stephen mentioned, which is sort of that end of life, end of contract scenario. In the monetization decaying scenario, as it was stated, you can't have an affirmative obligation to repurchase the assets. And so if you look at the decaying documents, they don't, right? So decaying always has the option to repurchase the asset. So then from a credit perspective, from a lending perspective, you then have to look at those assets and get comfortable with the fact that those assets are so critical to the functionality of the college or university that there is a high propensity that the university, the college would in fact repurchase the asset because they need those assets to function. And as a result, you have a revenue stream to repay your debt. In the availability payment structure, there is always an affirmative obligation, not only for the university to take the asset back, but frankly, the university or college has not ever really given the asset to the developer. All they've given to the developer is a concession right, a concession interest in revenue streams, and the right to deliver certain services to the university or college. And at the end of the term, whether it be an early termination or a expiration date at the end of the term, the handback procedure is really to ensure that the asset is being delivered back to the university or college in sort of what I like to equate it to is like a certified BMW type, certified used car type standard, right? Where you have a predefined, reliable, understandable, discernible standard that's set out in technical requirements that has to be certified by an independent third party at the end of the term. And if there is an early termination, what the lenders are underwriting is the fact that the university or college is promising, is required under the contracts to pay a termination compensation amount. And that amount fluctuates based upon whether or not it's a termination for a university default, for example, where you'd be paying equity plus debt, or if it's a developer default, where there would be likely a discount on the amount of the discount to the amount of debt that's being repaid, so typically around 80%, and then equity would not get a payment at that point. So equity would be effectively wiped out in a developer default scenario. So those are some key areas of complexity, coming up with key performance indicators. And if you look at Maryland, for example, Maryland State University is going through a procurement right now for another similar style project with respect to whether or not they're going to procure it as an availability payment or an asset purchase is still TBD. But there, they looked at historically when they've done these types of things in the past, where can they improve in delivering these types of projects, and the enforceability of KPIs and having well-crafted KPIs is an area that they focused on in sort of their after action report from transactions that they had done in the late 90s. So I'll stop there and then hand it over to others.
Okay. Hey, so Ron, my experience has been that whenever you do something different, you usually need a champion within an organization. And again, going back to sort of the planning side, whether it's the sustainability officers. So as campuses are approaching, who are you actually dealing with? Who's pushing for these projects? Is it coming from the financial side? Is it coming from sustainability? The capital planning group? Just give us a sense of kind of, again, how these are really starting, who's initiating them, what resources, both internally and externally, are being devoted, and then I'll have others as well kind of jump into this question. But I think it's important to kind of understand, again, where am I starting?
Great question. So I think historically, these projects have been pushed by the the head of facilities operations, really through the lens of the need for deferred capital and end of life issues. But in the current deals, we're seeing it elevated to a CFO-led function and a broad strategy engagement across all the business owners. So in higher ed, you tend to have a mix of those people championing auxiliary services, student services, student life services, and then you have core operations. And especially for utility outsourcing, it cuts across both parts of the institution. So you need to create a strong consensus and sort of a board of directors approach to have everyone joined up around the mission, the outcomes, and their needs on the project itself. So one reason why we run these strategic advisory engagements up front is to make sure all the parties are at the table, understanding the opportunity in hand, and that it's well balanced. When there's big money, it's always going to be driven by the CFO or the financial officer's function, right? With his tax advisors and his banking partners. They're going to be looking at costs of debt. They're going to be looking at whether there's tax equity in play. They're going to look at what to use with the concession agreement, all those things. Facility operations, the owner at the end of the day. So they're going to be concerned about the KPIs, the risk transfer, labor issues, how it fits into their overall capital planning needs, how much deferred capital they can take out of their stack and give to someone else to do. And that's the balancing act, is to make sure all these constituents are joined together. Student services are going to be concerned about transparency, sustainability outcomes, smart campus, impacts, metering and the provisioning for IoT devices. And there's usually a pretty strong IT infrastructure play alongside the energy infrastructure investments. And it's a big party. You have to host everyone into the conversation and make them part of it.
Great. So Jeffrey, sometimes we call the low-hanging fruit is good. You kind of get a win under your belt. One area, and I know UB has been successful, University of Buffalo, is solar. Do you want to speak a little bit about the, quote, achievable projects, let's say in the solar area? You're on mute. Jeff. So, Jeffrey, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'd be interested in what others think, but I look at solar projects, given the governor's emphasis on solar and wind and the college's desire to become, energy, net emission neutral, whether solar, installation is something that they're fully looking at. I mean, and I see the situation where they do it on campus, and I assume that they can generally replicate what's done elsewhere. There wouldn't be an upfront investment by the institution. The ownership would probably have to stay with the provider of the solar if you're going to do a tax, use the tax credit as a financial driver. The ownership of the renewable energy credits, again, I think would have to be discussed. I think the school would want to hold on to them if they want, sort of bragging rights to green energy. But they would have a system that is providing their school with green energy with the possibility of net metering. Then I wonder, and I wonder whether you couldn't somehow extend that concept to if you had a bunch of schools in a given area when one of them had the best land for siting, maybe you could site something and create something akin to community solar, where there are a number of institutions that subscribe to the power to be emitted, to be generated by this solar, whether it's on one or more campuses. You'll get some scalability there. You can look at questions of siting. And I think, again, with virtual net metering, I think the institutions, all the participants should be able to get some benefit, both from claiming, having contributed to the supply of green energy in the state, and also getting the benefit of using green energy. And I wonder whether, those ideas don't have some appeal. And I think even if they wanted to do a joint type of project, I think you could either use an approach where you have an SPC and there's ownership issues, so the tax credits go to the SPC and the tax credit investment. Or maybe you could even do it as a 501c3 deal if the economics made sense. We each would own a proportionate amount, through a long-term lease in the solar facility. So those are ideas that at least I wanted to explore. But one other interesting thing that I noticed that's going on in this state was there's a consortium of 13 Sunni campuses, community colleges, and there were 4 private institutions. I think one is Cornell, where they are working together, where they're going to enter into virtual power purchase agreements with a provider who's willing to develop a solar or clean energy facility that meets certain criteria. And basically, as I understand it, this virtual PPA that the participating institutions would enter into, they would agree to pay a fixed price for the clean energy. And then if the project sells its energy above market prices, the buyer receives the revenue. If the market price is lower, the buyer will owe the difference. It seems like it's a financial instrument, but akin to a derivative. But anyhow, it looks like that RFQ is out there, and that's how they want to help generate. And again, there's the question of who's going to own the RECs, these, because I think they have some value. So obviously, if the institutions want to retain them, I assume it goes into the pricing. I mean, I could elaborate on some of this, but I wonder whether these ideas, are a little bit more attainable. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in siting and all the other issues for solar, but whether that's something that at least should be on the table.
Sure.
And I guess you could add storage to that issue too, solar plus storage. And I guess wind, it seems a little harder to do, but that's out there too. And whether there aren't those kind of concepts that should at least be talked about, and where colleges could work collaboratively, get the benefit of someone who's going to be the team captain and help work the project through the various stages.
Right.
Just a thought.
I see all the panelists shaking their heads yes. Anybody else want to elaborate on that? Maybe Patrick, do you have some thoughts on that area?
No, certainly. Absolutely right. I think, again, if you have a progressive administration, you're looking at, historically power has been driven by coal or non-carbon friendly uses or sources. And as public institutions or just higher education institutions look at their sustainability goals, making sure and being able to defer the risk on the delivery of utilities or power moving forward, having a private operator is going to be important, and you can defer risk, and they're going to be able to adapt much quicker than a public institution, be able to change to changing delivery of power moving forward. So no, I think getting into the alternatives is going to be extremely important. And I know a lot of institutions are looking, that are considering utility deals right now, are slow playing a little bit because technology is changing so rapidly. They don't want to invest a significant amount of time and financial, I guess, compensation into a technology that 10 years from now may be obsolete. So it is extremely important that you really have some forethought on this and making sure that you're embedding the ability to change and having concessionaire or a provider of your utilities being able to adjust in your contracts, because 30, 40 years is a long period of time, especially with the way technology is progressing. The delivery of utilities and delivery of power is definitely going to change over the next 10 years. And making sure that you have that flexibility is absolutely imperative. If I could also add on to one item that Ron mentioned about who gets involved. If you go back to the case study of the University of Iowa, it really started with conversations between the governor and the chancellor. The governor is telling the chancellor that state appropriations are getting tighter and tighter, and the chancellor realizes that, so they came to a conclusion and said, let's do this together. Let's figure out what we can do. There needed to be some state changes. There needed to be some public or university changes to allow for their utility monetization. But effectively, it worked out. And I think Ron also mentioned, in every meeting that I attended, there's probably about 30 people representing almost every stakeholder. And I tended to try and sit next to the student representatives. So they had both an undergrad and a graduate student that were there to make sure that the students' voice was represented, the sustainability goals of the students was represented. And it was just always unique getting their perspective. They had a lot of questions on the financing side. They didn't understand. Most of them were more on the engineering side. But it was really refreshing hearing from them and bringing everything together, because you have the chancellor and the CFO and governors driving everything down, but listening to the stakeholders and the people on the ground is extremely important, because at the end of the day, you are an organization that has to make sure that everybody feels happy or understands what is happening.
So those are great points. Thanks. Stephen, do you want to add anything on the renewable sector?
Yeah, I thought I would maybe just a couple of things I could add, because we do quite a lot of work with corporate clients in New York and elsewhere on PPAs and VPPAs. And New York is a tricky market because it is a compliance market, which means that RECs are extremely expensive because they're one of the primary ways in which renewables are subsidized in the state. So being powered by attributable renewables is quite hard in New York because you have to retire RECs, which are expensive RECs, which means that renewable electricity becomes quite expensive because you're effectively competing with NYSERDA for renewable power. So I think what people are doing, certainly in the corporate space, is either seeking slices of projects which haven't transferred their RECs to NYSERDA and therefore kind of semi-merchant projects, but that's maybe 10 or 15% of a larger project, or engaging in REC arbitrage, which is effectively contracting with a New York renewables project, then reselling the RECs and using that money to buy generic RECs on the market. The trouble with that is you then can't claim to be powered by a particular renewable facility, which then leaves you with a virtual PPA, which is what Jeff was talking about. And that's where a lot of corporates have gone, which is a synthetic agreement, which allows you to secure project RECs, but for a project outside of New York. So it might be in Pennsylvania or a less expensive compliance market. And that's very common in the corporate America, less common in higher education, but Boston University entered into a virtual power purchase agreement with a wind farm in South Dakota, which I think which allows them to claim to be powered by wind, but also can draw a clear line of sight between their actions and that wind farm. So those are some of the options that are out there, and I think corporates out there who have got 100% renewable or net zero carbon emissions are kind of leading the way on that. So there is stuff that I think higher education can learn from that, but it's not without risk.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else, anything want to be added to that topic? Or
yeah, I'd just like to add that the behind the meter solutions are getting much more sophisticated. So we're seeing these combination projects, which include large deployment of solar arrays behind the meter with battery storage to provide ride through and power quality at the primary meter entrance, and provisioning for EV. So when you look at the path towards electrification of campuses, that is a bundle. It reshapes the load. It provides ancillary services to the marketplace so far as load balancing. The batteries can be reprovisioned for demand control versus sale of services to the marketplace. And we have some clients that are looking at basically putting batteries in for a full ride through outage, 4 hours, like rotating power outages in California, with EV provisioning and solar deployment, all inside of a PPA / battery agreement. This is the disruptive technology which is happening in the marketplace. So you have to have an eye on that. It's really well provisioned with the solar PPA. The other thing I'd like to add is the environmental attributes of project are a variable commodity. Calculate it, determine who can create the most benefit. You may want to have a blended financial model where the developer who can sell the near-term RECs can create the highest value, but then there's no reason why you can't claim them further down the road in order to achieve your carbon reduction commitments.
Great. I am getting some questions in, but before I get to the questions, I really want to have each of the panelists just kind of wrap it up a little bit in terms of just what other advice would you provide? Many of you are in the advisor capacity, so why don't we just go through? I mean, Jeff, kicking off with you, just any other general advice as people are thinking about these projects?
Well, I would like to just raise another issue, and I think the others can speak to it, is to what the schools that are able to provide the host for the solar sites, assuming we could ever find a way to a joint project, or even, is there a possibility that they can generate revenue by making the land available to the provider of the solar equipment, and who's going to be, going to be running it. I just wonder whether there, I mean, either look at a reduced rate or presumably maybe there's some revenue to be had. I just wanted to at least see if that's a viable concept. But beyond that, I do think that the solar and the storage is something that's worthy of discussion as opposed to these other things which are effectively trying to privatize, your utility club. But that's just my overview at this point.
Okay. Matt.
I was about to start speaking on mute and I caught myself. So
Very good.
Two things. One thing I wanted to note was that Ron's point around behind the meter is really a good one. And actually, so the Fresno project is in California, and there, one of the components of that project is actually solar voltaic panels on above a parking lot. And so you have the EV component as well as behind the meter resiliency, all wrapped into the P3 project. At one point, they were actually looking to have the developer also do the paving and the parking lot itself in addition to the solar, but it was determined that that really wasn't worth the cost of capital. And so that's the type of things that you'll think about as you're scoping the project. Is it worth to have these pieces in there from a phasing perspective, from an interface perspective? Does it make sense to give that to the developer versus retain that as a university? The other thing I wanted to note as well is that student participation is actually a key component of a lot of these projects. So shadowing, internships, technical analysis by students and integration with students, as well as university personnel, is a big part of a driver for why these projects make sense on campuses. And so that's something we've seen at Fresno, and that's something we've seen elsewhere. And it's definitely a priority for Maryland right now in their project. So I'd have to think about as sort of approach to what you're going to do to the extent that you want to do a alternative delivery P3 project. Is think about all the different components of a potential project that you might want, and then I would early on in the process engage the right types of investors and advisors, as well as experts in the space who can help ensure that the scope of the project is properly structured before releasing any type of procurement. Because I think one of the biggest pitfalls to a project is early release of a procurement before thinking through all these complexities, before thinking through the proper scope, and then later on having to basically restart a procurement and or having a failed procurement, and as a result losing interest from the market and potentially losing credibility. So I would stress that as a key component before embarking on any of these types of projects.
Excellent point. Ron?
Yeah, I'd underline those comments. You have to speak multiple languages. So understanding the view of the whoever is the financial officer position is really important. Oftentimes you need to run in parallel with their current accounting and reporting systems and what they have on the books. So get that right, so you don't get a no when you go to the finance office. And the stakeholder engagements around the boundaries and what you're going to the market is really important. Also, market sounding in whatever form you do it. An advisor will have ability to open up a communication channel with different types of developers that could potentially fit the project you want to do before you go into the marketplace. So we can be that communication intermediary. And there's nothing wrong with using an RFI in advance of an RFP, to make sure that you're getting as much innovation from the marketplace as possible.
Excellent. Stephen?
Yep, totally agree with what's gone before. I think the one point I would emphasize is seeking to gain, as much clarity as possible on the reasons for doing a transaction before you start, because that underlying sense of purpose is what will carry you through difficult times, and there will be some difficult times. And I think that's particularly important in the context of the market today, where a lot of institutions, both public and private, are receiving unsolicited approaches from developers, contractors, financiers, advisors for that matter, offering great things. And what that can be a great and valuable way of engaging in a dialogue, but it also, as an institution, puts you on the back foot because you're reacting to something that somebody else is offering you. So if you are receiving unsolicited offers, then maybe there's a good transaction to be done and a reason for it, but just take the time and figure out whether it's right for you or whether you're being led by the nose into something you don't really want to do or don't need to do.
Great, thank you. And Patrick.
Thank you. And I think looking at some of the questions coming in, it's when I look at the higher education market and just concentrating on publics, we're segmented into 50 states. Each state does public higher education differently. As I mentioned before, there's no one cookie cutter success story. You need to be able to define your goals, define successes, know why you were doing it. And if I go back, I think it was Stephen that talked about do it for the deployment of capital, do it for sustainability goals. The least important one is really from an accounting standpoint, how it's going to be treated. I know there's ways, and Stephen went through it in detail, ways of getting a transaction off balance sheet. But I think, as I've learned over the last 30 years, the accounting rules and treatments change over time. So you can't guarantee that it's always going to be off balance sheet. And that should really not be the reason. That should not be the main driver. It's obviously a consideration, but not the main driver. And then also, most importantly, learn from others, learn from their mistakes, and learn from the best practices, because what's going to define success for your project is going to be unique to you. But don't be on the cutting edge. Make sure you take advantage of all the other transactions that have been done, and realize and get consultants that know what works, what doesn't work. But make sure you stay true to yourself and define your goals and define your successes.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to address a few of the questions. I see some familiar names. I won't attach names to the questions, but hello to those of you who I know. So first, do you see RECs being phased out of the market in preference for direct investments? RECs have a shelf life that has caused some issues, including the potential for double dipping. Anybody in particular? Stephen, you want to?
I'll have a go. I'll have a go. It's a great question. I from a regulatory perspective, I'm not sure that New York is proposing a move away from compliance-based RECs, and the offshore wind regime is based on an OREC model as well. But what I would say is I think generic REC purchasing to claim 100% renewables or net zero carbon is certainly a discredited strategy, certainly in the corporate world. What are many of our corporate clients who have historically been purchasing generic RECs in the market are moving rapidly away from that, because they need to demonstrate additionality, and that additionality is through their actions, new capacity is coming onto the grid to decarbonize the grid. So I don't think that necessarily means direct investment. I think for the behind the meter stuff, direct investment is definitely one way to go. But just as in the world of P3s, there is enormous pools of capital out there who want to invest in renewable assets, and what they need is power purchase agreements to underpin the bankability of those transactions. So if you can offer a power purchase agreement, you can catalyze the development of a new asset, which gives you the additionality story without having to deploy your own capital.
Anybody else want to add anything to that question? Okay.
SRECs are a regional market, so they are defined by the market boundaries and the offtake commitments. So those are subject to change. My advice is to try to pull in as much of the SREC value as possible, like in the first 5 years of the financial structuring, and then take ownership. Because beyond that, it's kind of hard to imagine what the future SREC market will look like beyond 5 years.
Okay. Okay. I did not write this next question, but what role does Dasney play in P3s as compared to their role in a traditional bonded design build? I guess I'll take that one quickly. Dasney, in its role as both a builder and a financer of projects, has the internal requisite resources to kind of cover all the bases. We have tax-exempt financing. Obviously, we have a sophisticated construction group. But I would say also equally important is we have procured a list of empaneled P3 advisors We have advisors in both in the legal field, in the technical and program planning field, as well as the financial. So as we are, in essence, a conduit issuer, we are also in the position of being a conduit, a developer, being able to work with both private colleges and looking at opportunities on the state side as well to deliver projects in an alternative method. And I really prefer the term alternative rather than P3, because I know P3 sometimes, especially in the public side, can be somewhat of a lightning rod when you hear about privatizing. But really just being able to combine the resources, taking the information and skill sets that we have internally, along with our external partners, using all those combined to, again, help colleges think about their projects differently. That would be the role that we would see Dasney playing in that area.
And
Thank you for that question. Jeff, did you want to add something to that?
I just wonder, I mean, and it seems to me, to the extent that colleges have defined their goals, and I'm assuming sustainability is one, but they obviously have other things on their mind, whether working with Dasney to do, whether it be once they define their goals, to do an RFI or something to see if they could identify a joint project that would work, that meets the goals of the participants, plus has the benefit of scalability from who's ever going to be putting the project together. I mean, it just seems to me that Dasney could take a lot of load off in terms of getting some of that work done and reporting back. I would think that'd be of some value.
Yes, true, right. So another question. How does the cost or value of carbon offsets relative to a campus's climate action goals enter into the financing? How does the cost or value of carbon offsets relative to a campus's climate action goals enter into financing? Ron, do you want to grab that?
Well, first of all, it's great to have a cost of carbon. So, there are some state, markets for carbon offsets. The accounting for carbon is an important thing to do in any transaction. And the way you provide the carbon baselining, the sources of data, and whether it becomes a tax on this institution or something of value to the marketplace is TBD, to be honest with you. We advise clients to do carbon accounting alongside financial accounting, have robust reporting systems that are tied back to sources, especially on scope 1 and scope 2, and be innovative on scope 3. So that's where a lot of the alternatives around transportational, incentives can be accounted for. But it's a very important attribute for students. And there are carbon reduction, so many climate commitments by institutions. The challenge is actually knowing where they are in the glide path and what strategies they're implementing to get to those goals. And having a partner that can accelerate those and become an accountable and an accounting partner to achieve those outcomes.
Great. Where will the dollars come from to pay for alternative energy retrofits? And I think this question might be both at the public level and I'll say at the private university level. There may be sort of different answers to that, but anyone want to jump on that one?
Yeah, I'll take a quick shot at it. As I visit campuses around the country, there are several that actually have train tracks that run right through the middle of campus that coal cars run through routinely. And that obviously needs to be, if you'd ask every administration, that needs to be rectified. But funding that is no small task. So when you look at some of the transactions that have been done for utilities and extracting, or redeploying the capital out of the physical assets within utilities, I think a lot of the universities are going to have to be looking at it as, I may not be able to extract value out of it, but I may have someone be able to come in, significantly increase the cost that I'm paying for utilities right now, but be able to jumpstart, our commitment to getting away from the fossil fuels and really reducing our carbon footprint. I think it can almost be done without significantly increasing your costs that you're paying for your utilities right now, but you may not be able to obviously extract value because you're going to be turning over an entirely new plant and production of utilities or production of power on campus.
Would anybody else like to chime in on that? Okay. Specific to Suny, could you address the role of Suny in facilitating the use of P3 financing for energy projects on Suny campuses? I don't know, Jeff, do you have anything else you want to throw in terms of, on the Suny sector?
Yeah, mute. I'm not sure I understand the thrust of the question. Obviously, to the extent that the SUNY campus wants to engage in such a project, if it's on state land, with then there has to be the correct authorization to do that, and there was for one project years ago. I'm not sure quite understand the thrust, but if the college has a way of working with a provider, I think there are ways to structure it. Maybe I'm not understanding the question. So.
Well, I can add a little bit maybe too as well, Ben. We've had conversations, say Dasney, I've even done presentations at the PPA. We have now engaged with a panel of ESCO firms, how those projects get financed in the first instance. We've had in the past, and we'll continue to have discussions, with SUNY. Are they appropriation-backed projects in the first instance, with the payback still being traditional payback in terms of them paying for themselves? Are there other quote financing opportunities? I mean, right now as it exists, I know NYPA has actually done energy type projects with campuses. So I would see this as a developing conversation. Specifically as it relates again to Dasney, now that we have this panel, there are possibilities of on balance sheet financing from the ESCOs themselves. But I think there's a variety of opportunities, and we will continue to have those discussions with SUNY. Again, our program traditionally has been geared more towards the dormitory side, but to the extent there can be an extension of these agreements to the academic side, where clearly with central plan operations and so forth, there might be more value to these types of contracts. We will continue to look at that, and there's follow-up questions, and that's certainly anyone can reach out to me.
Yeah, if I can maybe just add one point, I
Sure.
think one of the challenges in alternative delivery in the US generally is just the lack of conformed templates and guidance, and for want of a better word, a rule book for how to do these deals, which does create quite a big barrier to tax-exempt institutions contemplating stuff, because there's just so much to learn and get a handle on before you start. So, without advocating for P3 or alternative delivery, if there is a way of providing guidance to institutions or campuses as to what to think about, what the basic rules of the game are, what the basic legislative framework is, just to make that contemplation easier and more standardized, I think that would be valuable.
Okay, great, thanks. A question on solar PPAs. If agreed to a 15-year term REC, what language should a campus have to promote flexibility for future technology upgrades in the industry? Maybe that looks like contract language, Matt?
I can jump in, and
Sure.
This is the point that I was going to touch on earlier. So one of the things that you can have is a mechanism in the contract that sets a standard at the effectively fixed proposal date for what the technology and what the project requirements are at that point in time. And to the extent that there is a evolution in technology as you're going through construction, or in the future as you are doing your life cycle maintenance on the project, those can be reevaluated at that time. And so typically what we'd see is anywhere from like a 3 to 5 year CapEx plan that is agreed between the university and the developer. And every 3 to 5 years, they recalibrate that based upon evolutions in technology, evolutions in requirements, and then make adjustments based on whether or not those types of requirements were originally included in the proposal, anticipated in the proposal, because some of those will be included and should be included and thought through in the initial proposal. But then to the extent that they're not, then the parties will come up with an agreed upon approach on how to pay for those. If there's a substantial cost, the developer, for example, could finance them. And if there's not a substantial cost, the developer could essentially self-finance and smooth out the cost by receiving payments over time over the remaining term of the contract. But I think it's a good point, and is one that's certainly thought through in most contracts.
Great. Ron, this one may be heading towards you. So is there any movement that you have engaged in to quantify the health benefits of moving off fossil fuels? If so, please share resources. If not, how do you think we can best start making that connection?
Great question. Getting right to the human condition. So, first of all, emission sources from fossil fuel generators. I mean, New York City has done a great job of mapping the impact of burning oil and gas on local air quality and particulates. And I think we're just going to see a growing trend towards the oversight of outside air quality in combination with inside air quality, right? So the best practices I've seen is universities have really taken ownership of the air quality management function. They build the meteorological stations, they do their plume studies, you determine what the entrainment of emissions are in their intake of their buildings. And they use all of that to optimize the ventilation systems on campus. And then on the inside, it's really about the quality of the filtration systems, the quantity of ventilation air. It is a constant balancing act, to make buildings healthy and the surrounding environment. But there are engineering tools to do so. Plume studies, UCI does wind tunnel testing for all of their emission sources to see to make sure all their outside air intakes are at the cleanest locations on campus for all prevailing winds. That, by the way, allows them to optimize their lab hoods. I mean, it's a really interesting integrative design function. But instrumentation, monitoring, and transparency in this area is just going to continue to increase. So get your fossil fuel emission sources out of your campus, or at least put them someplace where they're not going to affect, the breathing quality of your constituents.
Great. Anybody else want to add on that? Okay. Next question. Are you seeing any interest from the utilities to partner with universities and other large customers to offer geothermal well fields, other low carbon technologies under a DBOM/energy as a service model to assist their customers to meet their sustainability goals? Great question. Stephen, I'm going to pick on you on this one.
Yeah, go on then. Yeah, I think the answer is yes. There is interest. We're doing a project with Oberlin College in Ohio at the moment, which is a geothermal project, likely delivered under a DBOM model. I think utilities and bidders will, within reason, offer and provide whatever technology you want, though one has to be just mindful of the risks that come with that and the risks that they're prepared to take. So, resource risk for geothermal is something that, developers are cautious about taking. They'll take the technology and the performance risk, but the resource risk is not something that they'll necessarily take, in the same way that if you do a biomass project, they won't necessarily take a feedstock risk for any protracted period of time. But, unless you're contemplating something, kind of really state of the art, i.e. unbankable, then yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in doing this kind of stuff.
Okay. Interesting question. So paraphrase, electrification versus moving towards clean cogen. Comment being that have we potentially moved too far into the electrification field and not moved maybe more looking at clean cogen? Any commentary on that from anyone? Ron, you seem to.
Yeah, so I think the key point is reliability. There's no lower cost of standby, +1 reliability than a well-designed cogen plant that's running in parallel with the utility grid. From personal experience, I've helped build the UC San Diego cogen project, and it's allowed that campus to really create a foundation for microgrid technology, and the gas turbine has the ability to react quickly to transient loads and balance the power generation for the campus. So it is a mix, and gas is a transition technology. Batteries are not there yet at scale. It is an efficiency first. So let's be clear. This is a well-designed cogen system is a really super efficient boiler that makes electricity as a byproduct. So better than the utility ever could do. And it is a bridge technology. We already have high pressure steam or hot water needs. Labs and hospitals need that high quality steam heat. Does it need to be used everywhere? Probably not. But in some campuses, they're making that choice. But it also includes a fundamentally repiping of thermal systems. That is a big job. You better find a partner that's willing to be your design, build, execution partner over time, unless you really have the equivalent of a public works office that does utilities work.
Mm-hmm. Great. Probably down to just the last couple, but are there any case studies of P3 models for transforming central utility plant systems and associated infrastructure to geothermal/ground source heat pumps throughout the campus?
Oberlin, it's still in, it hasn't been built yet. It's still in development. That's the only one that I'm aware of. Ron, I don't know if you know of others.
Yeah, there's a few in the pipeline in the Northeast. You do need to address the resource issue, which is really pre-development and groundwater, and pilot wells and things like that to establish what the resource capacity is. But face it, geothermal has been in use for a long time on individual buildings. They are going in all over the place under sports fields. It's not a new technology. The question where does it get scaled up? How do you do the pre-development assessment to de-risk the project? And how do you create a phased capital plan? We have quite a few actually going through governance and capital planning right now, but they're not ideally suited for design, build, operate, and maintain because of the uncertainty in the pre-planning conditions.
Okay. I'll grab one last one. And Matt, I'm going to throw this one to you. How are public institutions incorporating items such as, opportunity goals as well as prevailing wage issues in these types of projects?
What a way to go out, prevailing wage construction law contract. So I'm going to say that this is really a lawyerly response in that it really depends on the type of project that you're structuring. We have seen it. We've structured projects involving public counterparts that do involve that don't require prevailing wage. It depends on how you structure it. We've talked about 5 or 6 different types of structures today, but we would say that is definitely an analysis you want to go through early on. And generally speaking, though, developers in New York State, if they're doing business with a public sector counterparty, are expecting to pay prevailing wage, and so it shouldn't be a barrier to entry for a project like this.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to wrap this up from the question side. We will be posting this entire presentation on our website, www.dasney.org. Any unanswered questions, I will either get to myself or send back to the panel for responses. But these were fantastic questions, and I really want to thank the panelists for a lot of insight into this area. So Ruben, I'm going to throw it over to you for any closing comments.
Thanks, Paul. I agree with you. I would not want to ask this group of people questions because you came up with some great ones. Hey, panelists, thank you so much. That was very, very informative. You all are obviously, leaders in the field, and I think that all of us benefited this morning from hearing your wisdom and insights, as well as some experiences outside of New York State, so we can learn from others. I just think it's a great opportunity for all of us. Thank you for all the participants. Your questions were fantastic. We appreciate you participating. If you have some feedback, constructive or otherwise, feel free to send an email to your Dasney contact. We appreciate our relationship with all of you. And Paul, thanks for organizing this. Great way to kick it off. We hope to do this more often with different topics, so look out for future invites. Everybody have a great productive day, be safe, and we at Dasney really appreciate working with you and look forward to working with you in the future. So if we can be of any help, please reach out to us. Have a wonderful day. Great to see everybody. Take care.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thanks, everybody. Great job, panelists.